The Boston night carried the smell of burning wood and splintering timber. On the evening of August 26, 1765, a crowd surrounded the elegant mansion of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson in the North End. 12 days earlier, the same kind of pressure had forced a royal official to resign. Now the crowd wanted to know how far that power could go. By morning, they would have an answer that frightened even the men who led them. The crowd moved with frightening efficiency. Men tore apart furniture built up over generations and ripped the cupola from the roof. They scattered one of the finest private libraries in North America, hurling manuscripts and books into the muddy streets. The destruction lasted until dawn. It marked a sharp break from the controlled political theatre of earlier protests, and it left the organizers with a problem they could not ignore. Behind the apparent chaos stood a group that had begun calling itself the Sons of Liberty, a name borrowed from a defense of the colonists in Parliament that February. In Boston, it grew out of a secret committee known as the Loyal Nine, then spread beyond a small circle of printers and artisans into a broad coalition against taxation without representation. That coalition carried both reach and danger. Samuel Adams gave the movement its voice. Harvard-educated and chronically short of money, he turned stamp duties into a question of constitutional rights. John Hancock, one of the wealthiest merchants in the colony, supplied the funds. Together, they helped transform unrest into organized resistance. They knew the risk. Open defiance of Parliament could be called sedition, and the men who led it could hang. So they blended public demonstration with secret planning, and they backed it with muscle. Ebenezer McIntosh, a Boston shoemaker, could put hundreds of men in the street within hours, while Paul Revere carried messages between factions that rarely trusted one another. Above them all stood the Liberty Tree, the great elm where the movement hung its effigies and staged its warnings. What looked like a mob was beginning to look like an army. They proved it on August 14, 1765. At dawn, Bostonians woke to find an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the colony's stamp distributor, hanging from the Liberty Tree, with a boot beside it, mocking the ministers in London. Officials demanded the figure be cut down. No one dared touch it. That evening, a crowd carried the effigy through the streets, tore down a small building they believed Oliver meant to use as a stamp office, and built a bonfire at the foot of his own house. They beheaded the effigy and threw stones through his windows while Oliver fled into the night. The next morning, he resigned. The lesson travelled fast. The Stamp Act now faced something more than complaint on paper. The attack on Hutchinson's house, 12 days later, taught a harder lesson. Uncontrolled violence could discredit the whole movement and drive away the moderates whose respectability it needed. Samuel Adams and the other leaders saw the danger at once. They moved to distance themselves from the worst of the destruction while keeping the pressure on stamp officials. The crowds had shown their power. Now the leaders had to learn to aim it. That meant building something broader than a street mob. The Sons of Liberty courted master craftsmen, small merchants, and professionals for respectability, while keeping the labourers and apprentices who filled the streets. Processions replaced riots, and disciplined ranks of marching men frightened officials more than smashed windows ever had. The movement learned to threaten through order. But the movement faced a deeper problem. Boston could force its own officials to resign. Parliament ruled an empire. If resistance stayed local, London could crush it one colony at a time. The answer was communication. Riders carried messages between Boston, New York, Newport and Philadelphia faster than the Royal Post, linking resistance leaders into a network beyond the reach of government. What had begun beneath the Liberty Tree no longer belonged to Boston. The method spread along the coast, carried by the same riders and letters. In New York, Isaac Sears and Alexander McDougall turned boycott into confrontation and met the soldiers in the streets. In Philadelphia, Charles Thompson drew in the rural farmers who feared the stamp would reach every deed and contract they owned. Charleston's planters fell in behind Christopher Gadsden. Each colony bent the method to its own conditions, but it was the same method, and it was growing harder to contain. The tactics hardened as the movement grew. The Sons of Liberty organized boycotts meant to push British merchants into lobbying Parliament on their behalf. They inspected shops and warehouses, tracked incoming ships, and published the names of merchants who broke the agreements. In some colonies, they turned to ritual humiliation, including the tarring and feathering of customs officials. The aim was simple: make enforcement of the Stamp Act impossible. By September 1765, they had nearly achieved it. Targeted intimidation and mass demonstration had forced every appointed stamp distributor in the colonies to resign or flee. They staged mock funerals for liberty, with coffins and processions that drew crowds without repeating the destruction at Hutchinson's house. In New York, they raised liberty poles and defended them when soldiers tried to cut them down. Organization had replaced impulse. In early 1766, the pressure reached Parliament itself. British merchants petitioned Westminster over their losses, and royal governors reported a government in paralysis. The Rockingham Ministry understood that the Stamp Act could not be enforced without an army Britain was unwilling to send. In the Commons, William Pitt argued that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies, while Manchester and Bristol merchants warned of bankruptcies if the trade did not recover. Benjamin Franklin, in London as a colonial agent, testified that the colonists would never quietly accept it. The choice came down to commerce. On March 18, 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, and royal assent followed within days. The Commons carried the vote by a comfortable margin, 275 to 167, as trade outweighed abstract claims of authority. But Parliament passed a second measure the same day. The Declaratory Act asserted that the King and Parliament held full power to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The ministry called it a compromise. It removed the irritant and kept the principle. In America, the network that had forced the repeal did not dissolve in gratitude. It stayed alert. The calm did not last. On June 29, 1767, Parliament replaced the failed Stamp Act with the Townshend Acts, new duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The same laws revived the power to search private property without specific cause. Colonial leaders saw an economic threat and a constitutional one in a single act. The cycle began again. This time the response began with words. In 1767 and 68, John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania argued that taxes meant to raise revenue rather than regulate trade were unconstitutional. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams and James Otis pressed for a united stand. On February 11, 1768, the Massachusetts House approved a circular letter drafted by Adams, calling on 12 other assemblies to oppose the duties together through petition to the king while still professing loyalty to the crown. London treated the letter as a threat. Lord Hillsborough, the new Secretary of State for the colonies, saw in it the danger of scattered grievances hardening into coordinated resistance. In April, he ordered Governor Francis Bernard to demand that Massachusetts withdraw the letter, and he instructed every governor to dissolve any assembly that endorsed it. Bernard delivered the ultimatum on June 21st. The House now had to choose between retreat and open defiance of a royal command. The House debated for 9 days. Moderates feared the consequences. Radicals warned that surrender would set a precedent for silence. Adams and Otis led the opposition, while the Sons of Liberty worked the newspapers and the meeting houses, and held up the men who favoured backing down to public scorn. On June 30th, 1768, The House refused to rescind, 92-17. Bernard dissolved it on the spot. The number 92 became a rallying cry across the colonies. Then political defiance turned into economic warfare. The Sons of Liberty and their merchant allies revived the non-importation agreements. Newspapers printed the names of merchants who kept importing. Committees visited them to enforce compliance, and women organised spinning bees and swore off tea and British cloth. Keeping the boycott alive demanded constant vigilance between the ports. The enforcement built a government within a government. Local committees inspected warehouses and ship manifests, published lists of forbidden goods, and isolated the merchants who defied them. Violators lost partners, received threatening letters, and watched their business drain away. By early 1769, British imports to the northern colonies had fallen by roughly 40%. The burden fell unevenly, and unity held only under constant strain. And then Britain answered the boycott with soldiers. British troops landed in Boston in October 1768. Their presence gave resistance a new and dangerous edge, and the friction in the streets grew sharper month by month. By the cold evening of March 5, 1770, it found its spark near the Custom House on King Street. It began when Edward Garrick, a wigmaker's apprentice, traded insults with Private Hugh White, the sentry on duty. White struck the boy with his musket. A crowd gathered and began pelting the sentry with snowballs, ice, and oyster shells. Captain Thomas Preston came up with 7 soldiers of the 29th Regiment to pull the sentry out. Church bells rang and drew still more people into the street. Sailors joined the apprentices and labourers pressing around the soldiers. The troops formed a semicircle with loaded muskets and fixed bayonets, while the crowd closed within inches and struck at the barrels with clubs. In the confusion, someone shouted what sounded like an order to fire, though Preston later swore he had given none. The soldiers discharged their weapons into the crowd. Crispus Attucks and Samuel Gray fell at once. James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr suffered wounds that would kill them. Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson reached the scene within the hour and promised justice from the townhouse balcony, and the crowd gave way. The Sons of Liberty named it the Boston Massacre before the snow had melted. They turned a chaotic street fight into a story of military murder. 4 days later, Samuel Adams led a funeral procession of thousands behind the victims' coffins to the granary burying ground. Within 3 weeks, Paul Revere produced an engraving that showed soldiers firing in disciplined ranks at peaceful citizens, a scene far cleaner than the truth. Printers carried the image and the depositions of selected witnesses across the colonies, and the correspondence networks made sure they travelled everywhere. John Adams and Josiah Quincy defended Captain Preston and most of his men, and the juries acquitted them on evidence of provocation from the crowd. The verdicts did little to undo the propaganda. Every March 5th, Boston held commemorations that retold the shooting and drew new recruits to the cause. The British troops withdrew to Castle William in the harbour, and that retreat seemed to prove every warning the radicals had made about standing armies. The movement survived its quiet years on organisation and memory. In December 1773, tea brought Boston to the edge again. On the 16th, some 5,000 people packed the Old South Meeting House, while Samuel Adams and the other leaders weighed their options. 3 East India Company ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay at Griffin's Wharf, loaded with tea that the colonists saw as one more attempt to force taxation upon them. Governor Hutchinson refused to let the ships leave without unloading. The standoff had held for weeks. That night, it would break. Word came back from the meeting that Hutchinson would not yield. It was the signal. Between 30 and 60 men, many disguised as Mohawk warriors, with faces darkened by lampblack, and wrapped in blankets, marched from the meeting house to the wharf in 3 parties. The disguise hid their identities and made a point. They acted as Americans, not as British subjects. They boarded the 3 ships at once and worked with strict discipline. They hauled 342 chests of tea onto the decks, split them open with hatchets, and tipped the tea into the harbour. The work took about 3 hours. The tea was worth nearly £10,000. They damaged nothing else, posted guards against looting, and punished any man who tried to pocket a handful. Witnesses remembered an eerie quiet, broken only by hatchets and the splash of tea into the water. George Hughes recalled that the men took off their shoes, swept the decks clean, and left the ships as they had found them. The leaders moved at once to control the meaning of what they had done. They stressed that the tea went into the harbour only after every negotiation had failed, and that the discipline of the act set it apart from common theft. The correspondence networks carried the news fast, and similar tea destructions followed in New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Parliament saw only an attack on British property and sovereignty, and its answer would push the colonies onto a far harder road. The movement had crossed from petition into open defiance. By September 1774, correspondence was no longer enough. 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. The Massachusetts radicals among them, seeking relief from the punitive laws Parliament had passed after the tea. The Sons of Liberty had spent months preparing the ground, using town meetings and local committees to shape who was sent and to strengthen the radical hand. In October, the Congress adopted the Continental Association, a colony-wide ban on British goods, enforced by local committees drawn from the same movement. The methods learned over nearly a decade had become continental policy. Men who had once coordinated through taverns and riders now governed as a national body. From there, the machinery of resistance became the machinery of government. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress declared independence. The merchants who had enforced the boycotts now coordinated military supply. The crowd leaders became recruiting officers. The correspondence networks that had once spread news of violations now carried orders for the militia. Samuel Adams and John Hancock, once hunted men in Boston, held authority in Philadelphia that would have been unthinkable in the stamp crisis. The Sons of Liberty, as a single organization, dissolved into the wider revolution. But their habits remained because a protest movement had quietly built the institutions of a new nation long before that nation had a name. What those institutions would now have to defend was no longer a principle on paper. It was a war,